Raphael Rowe, I'd like to first thank you for taking the time to speak with us here on After Prison Show. I know you have to be an extremely busy man with everything that you've got going on.
I'm welcome. And thank you for taking the opportunity to interview me, because I think the show that you guys are doing is important. It's important internationally, and it's important for prisoners, because prisoners need to know that they have a story to tell, and it's not all doom and gloom. That sometimes what they have to say is important in order to change things in the future.
And you know, I would be lying if I didn't say this, so I just have to mention this. You know, I am a little starstruck speaking with you, because you're somebody that I first ran across seeing Netflix, seeing the TV show that you host, World's Toughest Prisons. So it's an absolute honor just to have this opportunity to speak with you.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, but you know what? You and I are the same people. You know, I do what you do. I speak to people and I talk to them about their stories. And yeah, I'm on Netflix, I'm on the BBC, I'm on international media. But, you know, I breathe and poo and do the things that you do on a daily basis, as I do everybody else. And the one thing that's important to me is that I keep it real. I'm true to who I am, and I've never changed and never will.
You're an amazing person. You're just such an awesome dude. And I want to just share a little backstory real quick before we jump into the interview. I had first saw the TV show World's Toughest Prisons. That's where I first became familiar with you. I heard a little bit of your backstory there, which I want to speak about during this interview. But as soon as I saw the show, I messaged you on Twitter. I found you. I hunted you out. I found you and I messaged you. And I didn't hear from you for a couple of days, and then we made a video. Me and my buddy were sitting in front of the camera, and we were talking about you. We were talking about the show. The first thing that we mentioned was how inspired I was by the show, and that you were somebody that I really wanted to speak with. We did crack a couple of jokes saying that, you know, oh, I could do your job and this and that, and your amount of Twitter followers. And you responded to me on Twitter, and you even addressed that, and you did so in a comical way. So you received what I said during that video, which, you know, I did crack some fun at you, which I do apologize for now, and I feel kind of embarrassed sitting here being able to speak with you about it. But you received it well, and you did take the time to respond to me and did agree to do this interview. So for that, I'm humbled, and I'm just so very appreciative as well.
Well, first, I was amused by what you said, and I think it's important when people like me are doing shows like Netflix and the World's Toughest Prisons, that when people interact and they ask questions or they raise issues about the journey that I've been on, if I've got the time, and when you twittered me, I was on holiday at the time, but it gave me time to look at messages from people who were interacting with the program, because it is an important program all over the world. So when I read your message, I was amused, and I liked what you said. I found it funny, and I thought it was important to respond in the same way. But I like to interact with the audience. Why shouldn't I interact with the audience? They're watching. There are things that they don't know that they want to find out about. So I'm more than willing when I can. Now, obviously, if I get hundreds of messages or thousands of messages, I can't respond to them all. But I try to interact, because that's what it's about, isn't it? It's not just this body on a screen telling people about something. It's about sharing that experience way beyond a Netflix series. So I appreciate you messaging me, taking an interest in the story, taking an interest in me, taking an interest in the program, because that's what we set out to do. We set out to start a conversation about what prisons are like around the world.
And you know, I think it just speaks volumes about your character, what you just said right there, how when people do take the time to message you, obviously you're a very busy person. You do World's Toughest Prisons. You're a BBC journalist, you know, and I'm sure you've got just a ton of other things that you're doing as well. But just taking the time to respond to people and to show appreciation on your part who take the time to watch the show, again, I think that speaks volumes about your character.
Yeah, and I do that because I can't do it to everyone, but people ask interesting questions. What I found really interesting about the people that watch the World's Toughest Prisons, including yourself, is they asked intelligent, grown-up questions. They weren't demonizing the characters that they met. They were shocked by some of the characters. They were surprised by some of the situations I put myself in, but they were asking grown-up questions. So why shouldn't I respond? I'm not above them or below them. I'm equal to them, and I like to take people into that experience in the same way that I experience it.
I'd like to ask you some questions about your story, because your story is probably one of the things that compelled me just as much as the show that you host. But I heard you talk during one of the episodes how you spent 12 years in prison yourself for something that you didn't do.
Well, my story is unique, and I say that because I don't believe anybody's achieved what I've achieved, having spent many, many years in prison. At the age of 20, I was arrested, charged, and later convicted of murder and a series of robberies and sentenced to life imprisonment, never to be released. The twist is, I was innocent, and so for 12 long years I fought my wrongful convictions from the confines of a prison cell. And I won. My convictions were overturned and I was released. Since leaving prison, after spending 12 years inside, I went on to work for the BBC's flagship radio programme and the world's longest serving current affairs television programme, Panorama, at the BBC. I'm now presenting Inside the World's Toughest Prisons for Netflix. So I've made a success of my journey. I acquired skills while I was in prison, and I've used those skills and that experience to further my career. So I hope that what I've achieved can inspire other people who've been to prison and come out of prison and don't know what direction to go in. I really do believe that you can make good from a bad situation.
You would spend 12 years in prison for something that you didn't do. You were serving a life sentence. You got locked up at 20 years old. I mean, can you just briefly share with us the state of mind that you had to be in throughout the time that you were locked up, possibly feeling like you were never coming home?
Initially, when I first got locked up, I became a man overnight. You know, I was a happy-go-lucky individual who was 19, 20 years old, on the street, enjoying life. Didn't really have a direction in life, you know, just came out of school, was enjoying life, enjoying girls, enjoying, you know, what you do at that age. Not quite sure whether I was going to college, university, or whether I was going to work. So when I went into prison as this young man, overnight, I'm locked in this cell by myself. I was always in those 12 years held in a cell by myself. I never shared a cell with anybody else. And in those days, you didn't have sanitation. So I pissed and pooed in a plastic bucket that I had to take out of the cell every day to empty. And if I couldn't get out of the cell, we put it in newspaper and throw it out the window, if you could throw it out of the window. In my case, the cell bars were so small, so tight, you couldn't get a Rizzler paper out there, let alone your ship parcel, which is what we used to describe it. So they degraded me on the one hand. My experience for the first 1 or 2 years was very militaristic. You know, I didn't talk to anybody because I couldn't talk to anybody because nobody believed that I was innocent. I was just another guy complaining that I was wrongfully arrested, wrongfully charged, and wrongfully imprisoned. And I set out on this kind of mission of reading every document that came my way that had something to do with my case. And then there were grown men in these prisons who I feared every time my cell door was opened because they were convicted murderers. These were individuals who committed horrendous crimes. And I was a 20-year-old in a prison that was designed for men. And I was the youngest person in that prison and I was the most vulnerable. So every time I came out of my cell, I was scared. And one of the most difficult things is I wouldn't conform to the system. I shouldn't be there, so I'm not going to behave like a prisoner. So when the guards told me to get back behind my door, I refused. I wouldn't go behind the door. They had to force me. And that meant that I endured many physical beatings. I endured many, many months in isolation, in segregation, because I couldn't accept that I was in prison for a crime I couldn't accept that I was in prison for a crime I didn't commit. Therefore, I couldn't accept the regime. So I resisted it every day of every minute that I was in prison.
Unbelievable. I just can't even imagine what it would be like to go through something like that. It's a really unbelievable situation that you found yourself in. You would spend 12 years locked up. What would it take? What would actually be the point where you would get another chance at life? How did you end up getting released?
When I was taken out of the prison within the prison, I was moved around the British prison system. So I went to all of the maximum security prisons, some of the toughest prisons in this country. And I was housed in some of the toughest prison wings with some of the most dangerous prisoners. And I just want to elaborate that during that time, I always resisted the regime. And so I would end up fighting with other prisoners because they wanted me to sort of behave. I never made any friends because most of these guys were guilty, and by association, I didn't want to associate with people, not because they were guilty, but because we had a different mindset. They were accepting their sentence. They were accepting the time that they had to serve, that be 15 years, 25 years, 30 years, or life imprisonment. And I wasn't prepared to accept that. So I always made things difficult for myself. So in every prison that I went in, I refused to work. So they would insist that every day you would come out of your prison cell and you would go into a workshop and sew mail bags or stitch T-shirts or do some other menial job. And I refused to do that. So I was punished constantly put into isolation, constantly punished. And there were many occasions where when the prison guards decided it was time to remove me from my cell, they'd give me a good kicking and I would physically get beaten by the guards, stripped naked, put into an isolation cell, and then they'd come in and give me another good kicking for good measure. So I endured a lot of physical abuse. And then there was the psychological abuse, the fact that I was pleading my innocence to anybody that wanted to hear. Now, prisoners didn't want to hear that, and prison guards didn't want to hear that for a number of years. And then there was a chink of light. And that chink of light came from journalists who knew at the time that I was convicted that there was something seriously wrong with my conviction for this reason. The victims of the crimes that I was convicted of described the perpetrators of being 2 white men and 1 black man. They went as far as to say that one of the white men had blue eyes and fair hair. At the time I was arrested, I had dreadlocks and I've got brown eyes. My 2 co-defendants were black guys. One of them had dreadlocks and another one was very dark skinned. So we didn't even fit the description of the victims. And it wasn't just one victim, it was 3 different victims at 3 different crimes who described these robbers and the murderer as being 2 white and 1 black. So there was a chink always available. And then journalists started to write about that fact, that how could 3 black men have been convicted of a crime that the victims described 2 white and 1 black man committing. So there was an element of racism within the criminal justice system that convicted me. So when those journalists started to write stories about the unsafeness of my conviction, then I believed that something could change. And that change came about when my family and friends started a campaign that was screaming for TV documentaries and journalists to give some attention to our case. And slowly but surely they did. And that was one element. But the most important element was myself. When I sat in that cell 23 hours a day, the only thing I had was the documentation that led to my conviction, the paperwork that I read on a daily basis, not just every page, but every line and every sentence, day after day, week after week, minute after minute, second after second. And I never stopped reading until the day I was released. And so I built up various pieces of evidence, various inconsistencies and questions that I would give to campaigners or to lawyers, to take out to journalists to try to get them to write about. So the combination of journalists writing about the fact that we may be wrongly convicted and my persistence and militaristic approach to trying to prove from within a prison cell that I'd been wrongly convicted led to that very first chance, that the hope I held on to that kept me sane, that got me through those physical beatings and them psychological days in that cell, materialized.
You know, I want to say this real quick, and this is just my thoughts hearing this, hearing how unbelievable this whole story is, hearing how just the only paperwork that you had was the documents that got you convicted. This was information that you read every day, the campaigns that began, the eyewitnesses who were the victims who described the suspect as being completely opposite of who actually got arrested and charged with this. You know, your story deserves its own Netflix series. With the fact that you would actually get this second chance to be released, you know, what do you remember? And I'm sure this is something that probably sticks with you, it will stick with you for the rest of your life. Talk to me about what it was like to actually walk out of that prison for the first time after those 12 years.
Let me give you the build-up very quickly. So the British justice system wouldn't recognize that we'd been wrongly convicted. And so our constant banging at their door that they needed to reopen our case and reopen the appeal was met with disdain and typical status quo. These guys are guilty. The criminal justice system here doesn't get it wrong. So we had to take our case to the European Court of Human Rights. 21 judges read the paperwork and unanimously agreed that we had been denied the right to a fair trial and insisted that the British criminal justice system reopened our case. And so on that basis, the British criminal justice system opened our case. Now, on the day I walked into the appeal court and the judges listened to us present our case and our defense and the new evidence that we gathered to prove that we were innocent, the judges turned around and they sent me back to prison for 3 weeks before they finally released me. So I was sitting in a cell waiting for their final judgment. And that was probably one of the most torturous times of the 12 years, because although I believed they were going to release me, there was this very small doubt that they would do what they've done before and send me back to prison for the rest of my life. And that was hard to cope with. But I did get that knock on the door from a prison governor saying to me, your day in court has come again and we're taking you tomorrow morning. We turned up at the court. The courthouse was packed with family, friends, supporters, police, and everybody from the criminal justice system. And the judges said that our conviction was unsafe and we could be released. And it was at that moment I slumped and I felt the relief that I'd held on to for 12 years. I went back down into the cell in the Court of Appeal. They processed me. And then they asked me, did I want to go out of the front of the court or did I want to go out of the back? Because there was a lot of media out the front and I might not be ready for that. And obviously I said the front. They opened the door to the front and my family were there. And it was the first time in those 12 years that I shed a tear. I feared that if I cried in all those years I was in prison, I'd never recover. But the moment I embraced my sister, Joanne, who was one of the most prolific campaigners on my behalf, held me in her arms and I was able to cry. I knew it was the cry of joy, of relief and everything. And then we walked out of the court and you saw it on Netflix. When I walked out, that was the moment I walked out. 12 years of my life, from the age of 20 to 32, I've been wrongfully imprisoned. I was then taken, after I made that speech outside of the court, into the back of a black taxi, and I was handed a mobile phone I'd never seen before because they didn't exist when I went to prison. I didn't know what to do with it. My sister laughed at me because I didn't know what to do with this phone. And then the taxi took off, and the taxi went faster than I've experienced in 12 years. So just that journey from the court to the hotel that I was being taken to was frightening because I hadn't experienced that speed. The only speed I'd experienced in those 12 years was the speed my feet could take me. Yes, I was transported from the prison to the court, but that was in one of those kind of sweat boxes where you're in a little box and you can't see anything, so you don't feel or see anything. So that taxi journey was frightening. And it kind of spiraled from there. There was an element of joy and happiness and freedom, but there was also so much fear that not just I, but anybody that spent that length of time in prison and more experiences.
With everything that you've experienced, I mean, it's traumatic what you've been through. To be in a situation where there's a possibility you'll never be released, does this still affect you to this day? Do you still have thoughts about this? Any kind of psychological things that you deal with from the time that you spent locked up and going through a situation that could ultimately have been the rest of your life incarcerated?
When I was first convicted, the newspapers, and we have, prolific tabloid newspapers in this country, and they called for the British justice system to bring back hanging, to bring back executions, and that we should be executed. That's how much attention the case attracted, not because it was the biggest case, but because it was part of the criminal justice system taking a change, and they were calling for hanging. So if that did exist, I would have been executed and would never have been able to protest my innocence. I would have been hung, my life would have been over. In all the years that I was inside, I was bitter and I was twisted because of the traumatic experience that I was going through. But I made a conscious decision when I came out that I was not going to be bitter and twisted anymore. Yes, I still live with the passion of the pain that I suffered. I still remember every day of those years in prison, the things I saw, the things I witnessed, the things I experienced myself, the things I had no control over. But I made a conscious decision when I came out that I wasn't going to be as bitter and twisted as I was in prison. I'm not going to allow it to consume my freedom in the way it did when I was in prison. And I haven't. And I don't allow that time to torture me like it did then. There's no escaping it because I'm scarred by it. And so it affects my relationship with friends and with family because often I I kind of consume myself with that experience. But I try hard not to.
And that's evident. And this is probably going to be a monotonous question, probably a question that you've heard quite a bit through people who have interviewed you in the many interviews that you've done. But to go from the situation where you spent all of this time incarcerated and then to now be the host of a show where you're going inside of the world's toughest prisons. Talk to me a little bit about how this first came about and, any kind of apprehensions you might have had, any kind of hesitations you might have had about taking on a role like this.
I've been conscious since I came out of prison. I was very fortunate within the first year of being released from prison to land myself as a job as a reporter for the BBC. And so in the years that I worked as a sort of trainee journalist, I made a conscious decision at that time that I wouldn't use my time in prison as something. I'd use the experience to navigate access to people or to meet and talk to people that wouldn't talk to ordinary journalists, if you like, within the criminal underworld or doing stories. And so for 10, 15 years as a journalist, I avoided telling my own story. I'd use little bits of my story, but I made a decision not to tell my own story within those stories that I was doing. And so when I started to talk to a production company about making a film that looked at life inside the world's toughest prisons, I had to make a real important decision. Could I cope with going back into prisons around the world and living that experience? Fortunately for me, the prisons that I was going to were international prisons, and so they wouldn't look like or house the same prisoners that I experienced in a British prison. Although prisons are the same world over and prisoners are generally the same world over, their life experiences are very different. So when I was talking to the production company, Netflix came along and they said they wanted a presenter with credibility, somebody who had the experience and knowledge and the character to go inside a prison and not pretend, but to really experience. So if I was scared of something, I'm scared of something. I'm not going to pretend I'm scared. If I'm intimidated by something, then I would be intimidated by it. And I think Netflix bought into that idea. And so they asked me to present this show. And I agreed that it was something that I would do on the basis that I could reveal to the world what life is like in prisons around the world and how the countries of those prisons treat their prisoners and balance security with humanity. And that was the key of me going in and trying to open that debate. And I think that we've done that successfully.
I think that you have as well. I've seen a few of the episodes. To be honest, I haven't seen all of them. But every one that I've seen is so compelling in the way that you go in, they strip you down. I mean, you're reliving this. You are going in as a prisoner, and you experience it from the prison side. You experience it from the staff side. And then you also talk about the area where these prisons are at. And a lot of these are poverty-stricken, or all of them are poverty-stricken. And you really present this from a broad spectrum of sides. You really give the full circumference of everything pertaining to these prisons and the surrounding areas. How many prisons have you visited total?
The second season, 4 prisons, but there's another season coming with another 4 prisons, which I can't talk about for obvious reasons until Netflix decide they're going to release that. But I think my approach was very simple at the beginning. Anybody who's been to prison will know the mindset of a prisoner, especially when you're serving a long sentence and you're in high maximum security prisons. There is a mindset that helps you cope with that environment. Many people wonder what it would be like to go in prison. And as a result of the Netflix show, I've had lots of people come to me and sort of say, how did you cope? One, going into these environments that are so dangerous, but more so, how did you cope having been in prison yourself, fought so long to get out, but now you're willing to go back in? And there are 2 answers to that. First, when I go in and they strip search me, I automatically move into that mindset of a prisoner. I automatically move into that mindset that I have become a prisoner again, and they're treating me like a prisoner and they're strip searching me. The only difference is I'm allowed to ask questions. If I did that in real life, I'd probably get punched in the mouth by the guard for real and restrained and dealt with in a particular way. Whereas here, they at least knew that I was a journalist and there was a camera there all the time. So as I was taking off my pants and they were looking at my dick or my ass, I was able to ask questions of the guards about what other prisoners felt like. And I would answer the questions I like to think that prisoners would like to have asked, but have never been able to ask, and that the audience asked. And as I go through the process, whether it's the strip search or going into the cell for the very first time, I was constantly reminded of my own time and my own first journey into the prison system and being locked up in a cell and what it felt like, what it smelt like, how I would behave with the next prisoner. I tried to get the measure of prisoners before they got the measure of me. But it was the mindset. I'd go into that mindset of becoming a prisoner and reliving that experience. And the second answer to that is when people ask me, how could I go back in? It's more important than me. It is traumatic and it is difficult, but I think going into prisons and explaining why things are the way they are will change the narrative for people. It will open people's minds as to what an individual is like or why a prison is the way that it is, whether it's the lack of resources or the inability to keep people in prison, like in Papua New Guinea, where there are mass breakouts on a regular basis, and the resources that they don't have. And then switching to the guard side was important because, you know, I had a terrible time with prison officers and screws when I was in prison, but I'm not bitter about them. I'm bitter about the experience when I was there. So I think it's important also to hear what they have to endure on a daily basis and what they face. You know, they have families, they have children, they have sons and daughters that could themselves end up in prison, or they have friends that are in prison. And they're just doing their job. So it's important that I looked at both sides, and I think we did that sufficiently.
With the first season that you've done thus far being 4 different prisons and the next season on the way with another 4 prisons, you know, can you talk to me a little bit about how long it takes you when you get to a prison? How much time do you spend at one facility to get a show?
The process is pretty straightforward. I land in the country, and within the first day of landing in the country, maybe the next day, we go out with the police, as you see in the shows, and we try to get a sense of the communities that the prisoners or the criminals are coming from, the offenders are coming from. So we spend the day with the police, and that's almost the day after I land in the country. So me and 2 camera guys or girls will go off with the police and film that actuality. We don't plan anything. We just have the permission of the police to go out there and film whatever they are doing that day, whatever their operation is, whatever they feel is safe for them and safe for us. So we do that. And then within 2 days of being on the ground, I enter the prison. And that's when you see me get strip searched. And then for the next 7 days, every day in a row, I spend in that prison. We spend it can be from 6 o'clock or 5 o'clock in the morning right through until the night. So we spend the whole day, the whole week in those prisons filming. Now, the characters that we choose are not handpicked by the guards. They're not given to us. I interact with prisoners. If we think that they have a compelling story to tell, I stop and take the time to cultivate a relationship with them. It might be that one of the team who have done some research have identified, like in Ukraine, a serial killer. So we would then approach the governor because we wouldn't come across that individual during our time in prison. So we are aware of some of the prisoners maybe in some of the prisons. So we make a request to interview that prisoner and talk about why they're in there and how the prison keep them in there, etc., etc.
And, you know, I would like to interject real quick because when you mentioned the Ukraine and the serial killer, I remember that episode. And you actually sat down with this guy and you had the conversation with him. And then you saw this guy had multiple murders. And then he was married. And he had the conjugal visit where the wife was coming there and he had access to knives and all sorts of weapons. And I just remember your reaction to this. You were absolutely like just dumbfounded by this.
I was. I knew that I was going to interview a serial killer. I didn't know what he looked like. I knew the crimes that he'd committed. So my expectations were sort of unbalanced, let's say. So when I was sat in that room, and it was a deliberate kind of way of doing this because I think it's important with the way I interact with these prisoners. I don't want to know too much, but enough so that I'm not ignorant, so they don't feel undermined. He was very different to many of the other prisoners. In fact, he was probably the most uncomfortable interview I've done in my career as a journalist, and probably the most uncomfortable person I've met in the entire series and during my time in prison. But I waited in that room, and he came in and he was put in that cage and he sat down, and I looked him in the eye, and there was just this uncomfortable aura around him. And we started the conversation, and then he revealed that he was married while he was in prison. I was gobsmacked. He revealed that he had a child. I nearly fell off my chair. And then he invited me to meet his wife in his conjugal cell. Now, a few days later, I was taken to this cell block, which is, it's like a cell. I don't know if you get this in the film, but it's like he's inside this cell, which is like a mini bedroom with a mini kitchen. And there are 2 cell doors. And I walk through the first cell door, and I'm let in by a guard into the other cell door. And it's only the one guard. And this guard must have been like 19 years old. And it's like it's the first time he's turned a key in a lock. And I'm introduced to this guy and this woman who is half his age, a quarter of his age. And she was just freaky. I mean, I don't know any other way to describe her. And I sat down, and I just couldn't believe the answers they were giving to the questions I was asking, and there were obviously many more questions. And, you know, for me, the one question I really wanted to ask her is, how did she feel about the hands of this mass murderer on her body in this bed, in this room? And it was just so uncomfortable. And then he was very proud of the fact that he had a kitchen with knives. And I just couldn't get my head around the whole process. And I spoke to the authorities about this after, and they said, he, like every prisoner in this prison, has human rights, and we have to abide by that. We can't just give it to the robber and not everybody else. Everybody is entitled to the same entitlement. But it was one of the most bizarre, uncomfortable interviews. I mean, I do more in Series 3. There are some very interesting characters and very interesting moments and unsavory moments and dangerous moments, as there were in the first or the second season that I presented, but that was surreal.
Yeah, I remember that, and it just, I can remember just your demeanor when you first met with this guy. You weren't even trying to be friendly with this guy. You were sickened, from my take, from a viewer watching this. You could tell you were disgusted with this guy for his charges, so you weren't in there to try to befriend this guy at all. You just wanted to be able to ask this guy these questions, and then again to find out that he was married to a woman who was half his age and they had a child together. It was unbelievable to see, just me watching it on TV. I can't even imagine, again, for you, it had to be quite the experience.
Looking the guy in the face, you know, and imagining the crimes that he committed, women and children, 18 and younger, who not only had he killed these women and children, but he was a necrophiliac, which meant he had sex with their dead bodies. And then here he is in a room with a young woman, and I'm thinking, she's alive. How can he enjoy the sex? Is he going to kill her so he can enjoy it more? There were lots of things running through my mind, bizarre questions that I dared ask and did ask. Not all of them can make the program, but it was a surreal situation. I mean, he was a beast. There is no other way of describing this man, and he will, I hope, never be released from prison. And I experienced that on a few occasions because of the crimes certain individuals had committed. And I'm a true believer in rehabilitation, but the rehabilitation has to come from within. There is no system that can change an individual. An individual has to be willing to change, and they want to change. And when you've committed that number of crimes, or where you've committed multiple rapes or acts of paedophilia, it requires a very serious intervention to change the mindset and the behavior of those types of prisoners. And in none of the prisons that I went in did I see any of those programs for those individuals. So it was a fear for me that when people like him, he will never be released, but others like him are released, they will commit the same sorts of crimes. And that frightened me. It frightened me because prisons are supposed to be a place where prisoners are rehabilitated, if that, you know, it's a loose word because rehabilitation means many different things and it applies to different people in different ways. But most prisoners themselves, or most offenders, know that they have to be the ones to make the change. They can be helped along the way, they can be provided with services or systems or help or psychological or therapy, but they have to make the change. And when you don't have those services and facilities in prison, it's not going to happen, which is why, you know, the After Prison show, the thing that will give people an opportunity, I hope, to understand more about the inner workings of prisons and the prisoners that are in those prisons and what can make a difference. So programs like this, the reason I'm sitting here talking to you is because I feel they are important. They're important to educate people and change people's narrative. And it's one of the things that's come out of the Netflix, where people have said to me, I would never watch documentaries, but I found this fascinating and can't wait for season 3. I didn't believe that prisons were this bad in my own country, let alone in other places around the world. And I thank you for bringing us in and showing us things in a way we've never seen before. It's easy to make, I think, prison documentaries where you just sensationalize the drugs, the violence, and the conditions. I think it's another skill to show the characters that live in these places.
I want to touch on a few things that you just mentioned right there. With After Prison Show having the opportunity to speak with you, this is a connection that we've now made, because though we are a pond separated across the pond, you being over there in the UK, us being here in the United States, we're like-minded. You've obviously served quite a bit of time, way more time than I have, for something that you didn't even do. But here you are, a man who served time, who has come out and has hit the ground running. And you are here to open the eyes to the rest of the world who may be naive to what prison is like. I'm naive. I'm naive to what prison is like around the world. I only know what it's like here locally where I've been incarcerated at. You give me the opportunity to learn more about what the conditions are like for guys around the world. And not only do you showcase the conditions, but just like you mentioned, you humanize. You show that in these terrible, world's toughest prisons, you do have good, decent people in there. Not all of them, but there are decent people who, if potentially given another chance, could actually make a difference in their own lives. And with what we do and with what you do, I just can't emphasize enough how humbling and how appreciative I am to be able to meet your acquaintance, to be able to make your acquaintance, and to be able to just talk about this common interest that we have: prison reform, rehabilitation, and what it's like to serve time. Yeah, again, I'm really honored for that, Mr. Raphael Rowe. There's a million more questions that I would love to ask you about. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, so I'm just going to go ahead and wrap this up. And I hope that we're able to do a follow-up with you in the future. I'm definitely looking forward to season 3. It is season 3, correct?
Yep.
Season 3. I'm definitely looking forward to season 3 of World's Toughest Prisons whenever that does debut on Netflix. And to anybody who hasn't taken the time to check out this show, you know, I can give you my word that just seeing one episode, you're going to become a fan of this. Because also, like you had mentioned, you know, where people tell you that they don't even enjoy watching documentaries, but they see this, it is very compelling. It's very entertaining. But even more than that, it's educational and it's interesting as well. I have a lot of respect for you, Mr. Raphael Rowe. And again, I greatly appreciate you taking the time to speak with us, for allowing me to share you with After Prison Show and all of the things that you're doing. It just means the world to me. So again, just thank you so much.
Thank you very much for saying that. And thank you for doing what you guys do, bringing this very controversial issue, prisons, prisoners, offenders, crime, criminal justice systems, to people's attention, because it is important. And when season 3 comes out, maybe we could have another chat then. And if there is anything I can do in the future that helps people understand more, because I think you hit it on the head when you said connection. You've been to prison, I've been to prison. People who've been to prison understand that connection. It was one of the most poignant points during my time in the world's toughest prisons, that prisoners that didn't even know, because we hadn't told them I'd been to prison, knew that I'd been to prison, and pointed me out and said, you've been to prison because of your demeanor, or because of your character, or because of the way you carry yourself. And I think it's just normalizing things. I've been very fortunate to work on this program for Netflix, and there is more coming. And I hope that people take from it what it is. It's real, it's down to earth, and it's very simple for people to understand. Thank you very much for having me.
And before I wrap this up, is there anything that you would like to include where people can see more of you? I know you do things on YouTube and on Twitter. Is there anything that you would like to include where people can follow you and check out more Raphael Rowe?
I have a YouTube channel. I have a Twitter account, A Reporter. I have a YouTube channel that has some of the work that I've done for the BBC or for other international broadcasters, where they can look at some of the work I've done around crime or criminality or other injustices around the world or social injustices. I'm on Instagram, I'm on YouTube, I'm on Twitter, and where I can, I interact with people. I like to hear what people think about the shows and the work that I do, because that feedback is important. It informs what I do next. So if they want to, that's where they can find me.
I'm going to include links to your Instagram, to your YouTube, to your Twitter in this video so people can check out more and follow you. Because again, I think what you're doing is super important. And it's, in my opinion, one of the best shows on Netflix, if not the best documentary series that's featured on there right now. Mr. Raphael Rowe, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. And I definitely look forward to speaking with you again in the future and potentially doing that follow-up with you.
Thank you.